I heard them decide my fate through a door that wasn't fully closed. The sound was a low, urgent murmur, the words themselves less important than the panicked rhythm that pulsed beneath them, a frantic heartbeat in the cold, stone artery of the corridor. My father's voice was a frayed rope, threatening to snap with each desperate plea. My stepmother's was the sharp, methodical snip of shears, cutting through his weakness with cold precision. I was standing in the shadows of the West Hall, ostensibly fetching a shawl I had no need for, but in truth, I was simply breathing. It was the only act of quiet rebellion I had left. In our house, breathing space was a commodity more precious than gold, and I had learned to steal it in the unlit corners and forgotten passageways where I was most likely to be overlooked. I was Ilara, the elder daughter, the plain one, the shadow cast by my sister Rosalind's incandescent beauty.
While she was a sonnet, I was a footnote, a useful but unremarked-upon addendum to the dazzling text of our family's ambitions. I had long ago made my peace with this arrangement. To be unseen was to be unburdened. To be unheard was to be free from the obligation of a clever reply. But the words that bled through the oak door that afternoon threatened to drag me into the glaring, unforgiving light. "She refuses," my father whispered, the sound thin and reedy. "Rosalind has locked herself in her chambers. She says she would rather enter a convent than marry the Duke of Blackwood. She calls him a brute, a winter storm in human form." "The girl is a fool," my stepmother Anya retorted, her voice devoid of any maternal softness.
It was a tool, sharp and effective. "This contract secures our future. It pays the debts you so carelessly accrued. Does she imagine her beauty can conjure coin from the air? The Duke will be here within the hour to finalize the betrothal. He is not a man to be trifled with." A silence followed, thick with my father's inadequacy. I could picture him perfectly, his hand rubbing the back of his neck, his gaze fixed on the worn Aubusson carpet, anywhere but on the face of the wife who directed his life with the cool authority of a chess master. I held my own breath, a silent participant in the stifling atmosphere of the room beyond. Then came the words that were meant for me. "Then we shall offer him the other one." Anya's voice was casual, as if suggesting a different cut of meat for dinner. "Ilara, she is of age. She is quiet, obedient. He requires a bride of good family to provide an heir. Her features are acceptable. Her dowry is the same non-entity as her sister's. What difference will it make to him which daughter stands beside him, so long as she is ours?" I did not flinch. I did not gasp. I had been trained since birth to absorb shocks with the placid resilience of a wool blanket. My value had always been conditional, a thing to be bartered or set aside as circumstance required. I was a spare part in the grand machinery of my family's preservation. It was not a surprise, merely a confirmation. The only flicker of emotion I felt was a strange, cold curiosity. What would he be like, this winter storm of a duke? And what would he say when presented with the family's lesser, slightly damaged goods?
When the Duke of Blackwood arrived, the very air in our drawing room seemed to thin and grow colder. He was precisely as Rosalind's dramatic pronouncements had described him, yet infinitely more formidable in person. He was not a brute in the sense of coarseness. Rather, he possessed a severe, restrained power that was far more intimidating. His face was a collection of sharp angles and unyielding planes, as if carved from granite, and his eyes were the colour of a winter sky just before a heavy snow. Grief was etched into the fine lines around them, a permanent shadow that his immense wealth and status could not erase. I knew the stories, of course. a beloved first wife lost in childbirth years ago, a loss from which he had never truly recovered. He moved with a kind of deliberate stillness, a man who wasted no energy on superfluous gestures, and when he entered the room, all the nervous chatter of my stepmother died in her throat.
My father, flustered and sweating in his best waistcoat, performed the introductions. He presented Anya, who curtsied with a brittle smile, and then gestured vaguely towards Rosalind's empty chair, mumbling an incoherent excuse about a sudden malady. The Duke's gaze swept over the scene with an unnerving lack of expression. It was not a glance of assessment, not the polite sweep of a gentleman in a drawing room, but the direct, penetrating regard of a man who missed nothing and was impressed by very little. Finally, my father's desperate eyes found me, standing near the window where I had been instructed to remain unless spoken to. "And this," he said, his voice cracking, "is my elder daughter, Ilara." I curtsied, my movements steady from years of practice at being invisible. I kept my eyes lowered, studying the pattern of the rug. I expected him to offer a curt nod and turn away, dismissing me as the irrelevant piece of furniture I so often was. Instead, the silence stretched, taut and heavy. I felt the weight of his gaze upon me, and against all my training, I lifted my head. He was looking at me, truly looking. His eyes did not skim over my plain brown hair or my unremarkable face. They settled on the small, worn book of Stoic philosophy I was holding, my fingers pressed so tightly against the leather cover that my knuckles were white. It was a look of such focused, unexpected intensity that it felt like a key turning in a lock I hadn't known was there. He saw the book. He saw the tension in my hands. He saw, I felt with a sudden dizzying certainty, past the carefully constructed facade of the quiet, dutiful daughter.
My father, misinterpreting the silence as displeasure, began to stammer.
"Your Grace, regarding the arrangement, there has been a complication. My daughter, Rosalind, she is unwell. However, in the interest of honouring our agreement, we would be honoured, that is, we propose—"
He trailed off, a ship foundering on the rocks of his own cowardice. Anya stepped into the breach, her voice smooth as polished ice. "What my husband means to say, Your Grace, is that our family is prepared to honour the contract in full. My stepdaughter Ilara is a virtuous and well-bred young woman. She will make a fine and dutiful duchess." She presented me with a flourish, as though unveiling a painting of debatable merit. The air crackled with unspoken humiliation. I stood there, a substitute offering, a concession prize. I braced myself for the cold rejection, the scornful dismissal that would surely follow. The Duke's gaze never left my face. A long, agonizing moment passed.
I saw a flicker of something in those winter-grey eyes. Not pity, not anger, but something closer to recognition. Then he spoke, a single word that shattered the brittle tension into 1,000 pieces. "Good." It was not said with enthusiasm. It was not said with resignation. It was a statement of fact, delivered in a low, resonant voice that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. It was an acceptance so swift and absolute that it left my father and stepmother momentarily speechless. He gave a slight, formal bow in my direction, a gesture of respect that felt so profoundly out of place it almost made me laugh. In that moment, the winter storm had broken, not with thunder and lightning, but with a quiet, decisive shift in the atmosphere that promised a change in the seasons of my life. I was no longer a footnote. I was the text. I was sent away, not to the ducal palace to be fitted for gowns and introduced to society, but to a small, forgotten cottage on the farthest edge of the Blackwood estate. It was called Stone End, a name that felt both literal and prophetic. My stepmother had explained it as a period of quiet contemplation before the wedding, a time for me to prepare myself for my new station. I knew it for what it was, a genteel exile. I was the awkward secret, the unconventional bride who needed to be kept out of sight until the wedding day made my position undeniable. The cottage was cold, the stone walls weeping with a persistent damp, and the wind howled across the surrounding moors with a lonely, desolate cry. I did not mind. For the first time in my life, I was utterly alone, and the solitude was a balm. I spent my days exploring the wild, wind-swept landscape, my skirts damp with mist, my hair perpetually tangled by the wind. I read the few books I had been allowed to bring, their pages growing soft in the humid air. I was forgotten, and it was a peculiar kind of peace. A week into my isolation, a cart appeared at dawn, laden with a generous supply of split, seasoned firewood. The driver, a grim-faced estate worker, merely tipped his cap and said, "From the Duke," before departing. The following day, a thick woolen shawl the colour of heather was left on my doorstep, wrapped in plain brown paper. There was no note. These were not gifts of courtship. They were practical, almost perfunctory provisions against the cold. Yet they were acts of consideration. Someone had noticed the chill in my cottage. Someone had thought of my comfort. Kindness from my own family had always come with invisible invoices, a debt of gratitude I was expected to repay with obedience. This anonymous care felt different. It was a quiet, unobtrusive presence, a warmth seeping into the cold stones of my exile.
The Duke himself came 2 weeks after my arrival. I was sitting on the worn stone step, my book open in my lap, when his horse crested the nearby hill. He dismounted with an easy grace that belied his severe reputation, and approached not as a suitor, but as a landowner inspecting his property. He spoke of the cottage's foundations, of the need for repairs to the roof, his tone formal and distant, but his eyes kept straying to the book in my hands.
"Marcus Aurelius,"
he said, his voice a low rumble that was almost lost to the wind. It was not a question. "Yes, Your Grace," I replied, my own voice steadier than I expected. "I find his perspective calming."
"He argues that we cannot control what happens, only how we respond," the Duke observed, his gaze lifting to scan the bleak, beautiful horizon. "A difficult philosophy to practice when one is surrounded by complications." It was the closest he had come to acknowledging the absurdity of our situation.
A conversation began then, tentative at first, like a path picked through uncertain terrain. We spoke of philosophy, of history, of the stark beauty of the moors. I found myself speaking more than I had in years, my thoughts and opinions, so long kept under lock and key, emerging into the open air. He listened. He did not patronize or correct. He considered my words, his head tilted slightly, his expression thoughtful. He saw the mind behind my quiet face, and I felt a startling, unfamiliar sense of being truly perceived. As he was preparing to leave, I made a comment about the poor drainage in the north field, an observation gleaned from my long walks. A flicker of surprise crossed his features. "You have a farmer's eye, Mistress Alara." "I have a reader's eye," I corrected gently. "I read a book on land management from my father's library once. It seemed more practical than poetry." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, a fleeting warmth in the winter of his expression.
It was a sight so rare and unexpected that it made my breath catch. His visits became a regular occurrence. He would arrive unannounced, sometimes with a book from his own library, a volume of poetry, or a treatise on agriculture, leaving it with a simple, "I thought this might interest you." One afternoon, as he handed me a heavy tome on Roman architecture, his fingers brushed against mine. The contact was brief, accidental, yet a jolt of heat shot through me, sharp and startling. I pulled my hand back as if burned, my cheeks flushing. His gaze met mine, and for a heartbeat, the carefully constructed distance between us dissolved. I saw something in his eyes, a flicker of the same surprise, the same awareness that I felt. The air grew thick and charged, laden with all the things we could not say. He cleared his throat and stepped back, the mask of the severe Duke falling back into place. But the moment lingered between us, a silent, shared secret. A week later, as we walked along a sheep track overlooking the valley, the wind whipping strands of hair across my face, he stopped. "My name is Alistair," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "When we are alone, I would be pleased if you would use it." The request was a seismic event, a breach of every rule of propriety that governed our world. To use his given name was to claim an intimacy we did not officially possess, to step across a line from which there was no return. I looked at him, at this man who was my fiancé by contract, but a stranger by every other measure, and I saw the vulnerability he was offering. He was inviting me into the small, fiercely guarded space behind the ducal title. "Alistair," I said, the name feeling foreign and yet perfectly right on my tongue. He nodded, a single, sharp gesture of satisfaction, and we continued our walk in a new kind of silence, one that was no longer empty, but filled with a fragile, burgeoning connection. The stones of my cottage no longer felt like a prison. They were beginning to feel like the foundation of something I had never dared to imagine. A home. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, carried by a young boy from the village whose face was smudged with dirt. It bore my father's seal, a lion rampant that had always seemed more aspirational than representative of his character. I took it with a sense of foreboding. Correspondence from my family was rare and seldom brought good news. Inside, the heavy parchment was covered in my father's spidery, agitated script. It was not a letter of paternal affection or inquiry into my well-being. It was a business transaction. He wrote of the wedding date, of the final transfer of funds as stipulated by the marriage contract, his words cold and mercenary. He was reminding the Duke of his financial obligations. My stomach twisted. But it was the second document, folded neatly inside the first, that made the blood drain from my face.
It was a copy of the original betrothal agreement, the one made for Rosalind. My father had included it as a pointed reminder of the terms. My eyes scanned the dense legal language until they snagged on a particular clause, underlined twice in my father's ink. It stated with brutal clarity that should the prospective bride, one Rosalind Valerius, refuse the match, our family would be liable to the Duke of Blackwood for a sum so vast it would mean utter ruin. Our lands, our home, our name, all would be forfeit. Unless, a final addendum clarified, a suitable substitute from the same family was offered and accepted. The room tilted. The walls of the cottage, which had begun to feel like a sanctuary, suddenly felt like the bars of a cage built by my own family's desperation. Every act of kindness from Alistair, every shared look, every thoughtful book, was instantly recontextualized. His acceptance of me had not been a surprising choice. It had been a financial calculation.
He had saved my family from destitution by taking me. I was not a bride. I was a payment, a human coin used to settle a debt. The warmth that had begun to bloom in my chest turned to ice. His attentiveness, his conversations, the intimacy of his name, had it all been a charade? A way to make the bitter pill of a plain, unwanted bride easier to swallow? The kindness that had felt so pure was now tainted with the bitter taste of obligation. I was still standing there, the contract clutched in my hand, when he arrived for his daily visit. He must have seen the look on my face, the devastation that I was too stunned to hide, because the polite inquiry about my day died on his lips. His gaze dropped to the papers in my hand. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low and cautious. I held out the letter, my hand shaking. "My father sent a reminder," I said, my voice a thin, brittle thing, "about the contract, about the clause that would have ruined him if you had not been so accommodating." The word tasted like poison. He took the papers, his expression unreadable as he scanned the familiar words. He did not deny it. He did not offer excuses. He simply folded the documents with a slow, deliberate precision and placed them on the small wooden table. The silence was a chasm between us. "Was this all it was?" I finally whispered, the question tearing from my throat. Was I simply the more palatable option than seizing my family's estate? A matter of convenience? Alistair looked at me, and for the first time I saw not the severe duke or the thoughtful companion, but a man in profound conflict. His jaw was tight, a muscle twitching near his temple. "At first," he began, his voice rough with an emotion I couldn't name, "the entire arrangement was a matter of convenience. I require an heir. Your family required financial stability. It was a cold, unfortunate piece of business. I came to your home that day, expecting to finalize a distasteful but necessary contract with a beautiful, empty-headed girl." He took a step closer, his eyes holding mine with a desperate intensity. "I did not plan for a quiet woman standing by the window, holding a book of philosophy as if it were a shield. I did not plan for her astute observations about crop rotation, or for the way her eyes light up when she speaks of Roman history. I did not plan for her courage in the face of exile, or for the simple, unadorned grace with which she carries herself." His voice dropped, becoming thick with feeling. Everything about the contract was a catastrophe I had planned for. "You, Ilara," he said, and my name was a prayer on his lips, "were the catastrophe I did not." The raw honesty of his words struck me with the force of a physical blow. He was not denying the cold reality of our beginning, but he was rewriting the narrative of our present. The chasm between us did not vanish, but a bridge, fragile and tenuous, was beginning to form. Before I could process the turmoil of his confession, he moved to the small satchel he had brought with him. From it, he withdrew another set of papers, bound with a solicitor's ribbon. He held them out to me. "My father's letter arrived at the estate this morning," he said. This was my reply. "It was drafted 3 weeks ago, the day after you first told me about the book on land management." My hands trembled as I took the documents. It was official correspondence from his solicitor to mine. It was a formal addendum to the marriage contract. It declared in unequivocal legal terms that the penalty clause concerning my family's debt was null and void. It was an act of forgiveness, a complete release of the obligation, dated weeks before my father's grasping letter had ever been sent. He had freed my family, not because he was forced to, but because he had chosen to. The proof was right there, in black and white. He had done it not for them, but for me.
"The debt was an anchor," Alistair said, his voice low and earnest, his gaze never leaving my face. "It tethered you to them, and me to this cold bargain. I had it severed because I wanted you to be here on your own terms, free. I wanted the woman I marry to choose to stand beside me, not to be delivered as payment for her family's folly." He closed the remaining distance between us, his presence filling the small cottage, his shadow falling over me. "I have lived in a fortress of my own making for 5 years, Ilara, a place of duty and memory and grief. The walls were high, the gates were barred. I let no one in." He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before his fingers gently touched my cheek.
His touch was not possessive, but reverent. And then you arrived. You did not storm the gates. You did not lay siege. You simply stood outside, in the wind and the cold, and you were yourself. Your quiet strength, your incisive mind, your resilience. It has unmade me. You have dismantled my fortress, stone by stone, without ever realizing it. Tears I hadn't realized I was holding back began to slide down my cheeks. They were not tears of sorrow or humiliation, but of a profound, overwhelming release. He was not just accepting me, he was choosing me. He was seeing me, Ilara, in my entirety. "I am asking you now," he continued, his voice thick with a vulnerability I never thought to witness in such a man. "Not as a substitute, not as a contractual obligation, but as the only woman I would ask. Ilara Valerius, will you be my wife? Will you be my Duchess? Will you help me build something new from the ruins?" His proposal hung in the air, a thing of breathtaking sincerity. This was not the cold pronouncement of a duke securing an heir. It was the heartfelt plea of a man asking for a partner. I looked at him, at the winter in his eyes that was now thawing, at the strength in his face that was tempered by a newfound gentleness, and I knew my answer. I had known it for weeks, in the quiet moments between the lines of the books we shared and the silent understanding of our walks on the moor. "Yes," I breathed, the word a quiet affirmation that sealed not a contract, but a promise. "Yes, Alistair, I will." The pre-wedding ball was a glittering affair, a sea of silks and jewels designed to overwhelm the senses. Blackwood Manor, which had felt like a quiet haven of libraries and thoughtful corridors during my private visits with Alistair, was now transformed into a stage for the grand theatre of society. My family had arrived that afternoon, my stepmother Anya sweeping in with an air of triumphant ownership, Rosalind trailing behind her, looking pale and subdued. My father simply looked lost, a man adrift in a world far grander than his own. I wore a gown of deep sapphire velvet, a gift from Alistair. It was simple but exquisitely made, and for the first time in my life, I did not feel plain. I felt solid, grounded. When Alistair took my arm to lead me into the ballroom, his touch was a warm, reassuring pressure, a silent promise of solidarity. We were a united front. We would need to be. The whispers followed us like the rustle of dry leaves. I saw the curious glances, the poorly concealed smirks. The story of the substituted bride was the choicest piece of gossip of the season. I kept my head high, my gaze fixed forward, my hand resting securely on my future husband's arm. The confrontation came, as I knew it must, near the grand staircase.
Anya, her face a mask of false concern, cornered me with Lord Finch in tow. Finch was a man of middling title and immense ambition, one of Rosalind's most persistent suitors, who now looked upon me with unconcealed scorn.
"My dear Ilara,"
Anya began, her voice loud enough for the surrounding guests to hear.
"You look quite overwhelmed. One can hardly blame you. To be thrust into such a position, it is a testament to the Duke's immense generosity, is it not?"
Her words were honey-laced poison, painting me as a charity case. Lord Finch stepped forward, his lip curled in a sneer.
"Generosity, Lady Anya? Or desperation? One hears the Duke's coffers were the only thing capable of saving your family from ruin. A most convenient arrangement. He gets a passable broodmare, and you avoid debtor's prison."
The insult was so crude, so public, that a hush fell over the nearby clusters of guests. My face burned, but I refused to look away.
I would not give them the satisfaction of my retreat. "You are mistaken, Lord Finch," I said, my voice low but clear. "There is no debt." "Oh, my dear, lying will not help you," Anya chided, shaking her head in mock pity. "We all know the truth. You snared him. You trapped him with your family's pitiful circumstances, a desperate spinster clinging to the only chance she might ever have." It was then that Alistair materialized at my side. He had not been far, I realized. He had been watching, waiting. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to.
His very presence commanded the attention of the room.
"Lord Finch,"
he said, his voice as cold and sharp as breaking ice.
"You will apologize to my future wife."
Finch scoffed.
"And why should I? For speaking the truth? The whole ton knows she is nothing but a replacement for the bride you truly wanted." "The only truth here,"
Alistair stated, his voice resonating with quiet authority,
"is that you are a man of poor character, and even poorer judgment."
He produced a sheaf of letters from his coat pocket.
"I also have here some rather interesting correspondence. Letters from you, Lord Finch, to Lady Anya, outlining a rather pathetic scheme to slander Ilara in the hopes of breaking our engagement. You seemed to believe that with her out of the way, I might be persuaded to take the other sister, and you might then have a claim on the dowry you mistakenly believed she had."
He let the words hang in the air, each one a death knell to Finch's reputation.
He then turned his cool gaze upon my stepmother. "And as for the matter of debt," he continued, producing the solicitor's letter, "this document, signed and sealed weeks ago, formally absolves Lord Valerius of any and all financial obligation to me. I forgave the debt freely. Therefore, this marriage is not, and never has been, a transaction. It is a choice. My choice." The silence in the ballroom was absolute. Anya's face had gone slack with shock. her carefully constructed composure crumbling into dust. Lord Finch was ashen, his eyes darting about for an escape that did not exist. This was my moment. I turned to face my stepmother, not with anger, but with a profound and weary clarity.